Marcus spent 11 years working toward one number. He wasn't obsessed with a car or a house or a title. He was obsessed with a salary. $100,000 a year. That was the threshold in his mind. The number that represented arrival. He'd grown up in a household where his parents made a combined $58,000 and money was always the source of tension, the thing that made his mother go quiet at the kitchen table, the reason vacations were rare and arguments weren't. He told himself that when he crossed $100,000, all of that anxiety would be behind him. He would finally feel what he imagined wealthy people felt. Calm. Secure. Free. At 31, he got there. The offer letter said $103,000. He sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment complex and read it 3 times. For about 6 weeks, he felt exactly what he'd imagined. He slept better. He walked differently. He called his mother and told her, and she cried. Then something happened that nobody had warned him about. The feeling started to fade. The bills that seemed manageable now seemed slightly larger, not smaller. The apartment he'd been fine with suddenly seemed inadequate for someone at his level. He upgraded. He bought a car that matched his new identity. He started spending the way he believed a person who made $103,000 should spend. And 18 months after crossing the threshold he'd spent a decade chasing, Marcus had $6,200 in his savings account, a monthly expense load that required nearly every dollar he earned, and an anxiety about money that felt almost identical to the anxiety he'd grown up watching at the kitchen table. The number changed. The feeling didn't. Now I want to tell you about someone else. Priya crossed $100,000 at 29. She'd read enough and thought enough about money that when the number arrived, she made a set of very specific, very deliberate decisions in the first 30 days. Not dramatic ones. Not complicated ones. Just clear ones. By the time she was 34, she had $190,000 in invested assets, a monthly financial structure that required only 60% of her income, and the ability to take 4 months off when her father got sick. Without financial panic, without credit card debt, without asking anyone for help. Same threshold. Completely different outcomes. Here is the question nobody asks out loud. Why does crossing $100,000 make some people's financial lives better and other people's financial lives worse? Pause. Music fades in softly. This isn't about what the number feels like. It's about what the number does and what you do in response to it in the months immediately after you cross it. Because $100,000 is not just a salary milestone. It's a decision point. And most people walk into it completely unprepared for the specific ways it will test them, tempt them, and quietly reshape their financial identity without them ever realizing it's happening. I'm going to show you the real rules of what happens when you finally reach this number, the psychological shifts, the financial traps, the invisible pressures, and the specific decisions that determine whether this milestone becomes the beginning of genuine wealth or just a more expensive version of the financial stress you were already living with. These are the things nobody tells you when the offer letter arrives. And if you're approaching this number, already at it, or watching someone else navigate it, these rules will change how you see the entire thing. Transition to core content. Rule 1. The moment you cross $100,000, your identity changes before your bank account does, and that identity shift is the most financially dangerous thing that will happen to you. This is the rule that explains Marcus. And it explains thousands of people who've crossed this threshold and ended up confused about why it didn't feel the way they expected. When you earn $100,000, you no longer think of yourself as someone who earns under 6 figures. That sounds obvious. But the identity shift that comes with it is not just emotional. It's behavioral. It immediately starts reshaping what you believe you deserve, what you believe is appropriate for someone at your level, and what you believe you can justify spending on. The new identity says things like, I've earned this. I work hard. I can afford it now. I don't need to count every dollar the way I used to. People who make this kind of money don't drive that kind of car. And every single one of those thoughts is your new identity spending money on your behalf before you've made a single conscious financial decision. Here's a real-world example of what this looks like. Before the salary, you drove a 2017 sedan you owned outright and paid $180 a month for insurance. After the salary, your new identity decides that car doesn't reflect who you've become. You upgrade to something newer. The payment is $520 a month, insurance goes to $240, and you've committed $760 per month to transportation before you've bought a single tank of gas. That's $9,120 a year. That's $91,200 over the next decade, most of which would have compounded significantly if invested. The identity spent it. You barely noticed. The psychological insight here is that identity-based spending is almost impossible to resist through willpower alone because it doesn't feel like overspending. It feels like finally spending appropriately. The resistance only works if you examine the identity itself before it starts making decisions. You have to ask, is this genuinely what I value, or is this what I believe someone at my income level is supposed to look like? Rule 2. Your taxes will do something that genuinely surprises most people, and not being prepared for it leads to one of the most common six-figure financial mistakes. Most people understand taxes in theory. Very few people understand what actually happens to their effective tax rate as they cross into higher income territory, and even fewer are prepared for the specific shock of their first paycheck at the new salary. Here's the reality. At $100,000 of W-2 income in the United States, your federal tax burden, before state taxes, before FICA contributions, lands your effective federal rate somewhere around 18 to 22%, depending on your deductions and filing status. Add state income taxes, which range from 0 to over 13%, depending on where you live. Add Social Security and Medicare contributions of 7.65% on the first $160,000 of earnings. And suddenly your $100,000 salary is producing a take-home that many people are genuinely shocked by. In a state like California or New York, a $100,000 salary can produce a monthly take-home of roughly $5,700 to $6,200. That's between $68,400 and $74,400 per year in actual spendable income, not $100,000. The identity that forms around the $100,000 number starts spending against $100,000. The bank account only receives $70,000. That gap between what the salary sounds like and what actually lands is where a significant amount of lifestyle inflation begins. People build spending patterns that assume the gross income. They then spend the next several years wondering why the math never quite works. But here's what most people miss. The tax situation at $100,000 is also the moment when tax planning starts to matter in a way it simply didn't before. Retirement contributions, health savings account contributions, flexible spending accounts, these are tools that at lower incomes produce modest benefits. At $100,000, they produce meaningful, compounding, wealth-building benefits. A full HSA and 401k contribution can reduce your taxable income by nearly $30,000, potentially dropping you an entire tax bracket and saving thousands in a single year. Most people at this income level use none of these tools effectively. Rule 3. The people in your life will change how they see you, and that change will cost you money in ways you will never see on a receipt. Nobody warns you about this one. But it is real, it is consistent, and it is expensive. When the people around you, friends, family, colleagues, even acquaintances, learn or perceive that you've crossed into six-figure income, something shifts in how they interact with you around money. It's subtle. Most of them aren't even conscious of it. But it shows up in specific, recurring ways. The dinner bill gets split, but when you're at the table, somehow you end up paying slightly more, or covering the tax, or grabbing the round. Your family starts assuming you can handle certain expenses others can't. A sibling needs a loan. A parent needs help with something. A friend suggests a vacation that costs 3 times what you'd typically spend, with the implicit understanding that it's now within your range. Social events start escalating in cost because the group calibrates to whoever seems most able. None of these individual moments is catastrophic. Together, they create a consistent financial drain that doesn't show up in any budget category because it's social. It's relationship-based. And saying no to it feels like a betrayal of people you love or a signal that you think you're above others now. It gets worse. The expectation compounds. The first time you cover something generously, it becomes the precedent. The social contract shifts. And walking it back later is significantly more socially costly than it would have been to manage the expectation clearly from the beginning. The practical response to this rule is not to become closed-fisted with people you love. It's to be clear and consistent from the start. Having one honest conversation about what you can and can't commit to financially is significantly less painful than a year of resentful compliance, followed by a difficult reckoning. Rule 4. $100,000 is the exact income level where financial advisors, product salespeople, and well-meaning but poorly informed people will start competing aggressively for your money. The moment you cross a certain income threshold, you become a target for a specific category of financial attention that you were mostly invisible to before. This isn't cynical. It's just accurate. At $40,000, almost nobody is trying to sell you whole life insurance as an investment vehicle, pitch you on a managed portfolio with a 1% annual fee, or suggest you need a complex estate planning structure. At $100,000, all of that begins. The reason is straightforward. You now have enough income that financial products can generate meaningful commissions and ongoing fees from your decisions. A 1% annual management fee on $50,000 is $500 a year. On $500,000, it's $5,000. The financial services industry knows that people who start investing at $100,000, if managed well, will have significant assets within a decade. Getting there first and staying there is enormously valuable to them. The specific products that consistently underperform for people at this income level are worth naming directly. Whole life and universal life insurance policies marketed as wealth-building vehicles almost universally produce inferior returns compared to buying term insurance and investing the difference. Actively managed mutual funds with expense ratios above 0.5% consistently underperform their passive index fund equivalents over 10-plus-year periods, according to nearly every long-term study of fund performance. Annuities sold to people in their 30s as tax-advantaged savings vehicles are almost never the right tool for that job. The psychological insight is that at $100,000, you start feeling like you need professional complexity. You've reached a level where surely the simple index fund strategy isn't sophisticated enough. Surely someone with credentials and a nice office can do better. This feeling is worth interrogating carefully because the evidence consistently suggests that the simple, low-cost, index-based approach outperforms most of the complexity being sold to you. Rule 5. Your relationship with risk will change in a direction that quietly costs you money for decades. This one is counterintuitive and almost nobody talks about it. Most people assume that as income rises, people become more financially bold, more willing to invest aggressively, more comfortable with risk. The opposite is often true. When you have very little, you don't have much to lose. You invest in index funds, you take the long view, you accept volatility because what's the alternative? But when you've crossed $100,000 and started accumulating a meaningful account balance, when you can see $40,000 or $60,000 in your investment account for the first time, the psychology shifts. That number becomes something you can lose. It becomes real in a way it wasn't before. And that realness makes you more emotionally reactive to market movements, more vulnerable to shifting to conservative positions at exactly the wrong moments, and more susceptible to the kind of fear-driven decisions that destroy long-term returns. Here's a real-world example of what this costs. During the March 2020 market decline, a significant number of investors moved assets to cash or bonds. The market recovered to its pre-crash level in approximately 5 months. Investors who moved to cash and waited for certainty before reinvesting missed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the recovery, depending on when they re-entered. The people with the most to lose, who moved to protect it, often lost the most. The hidden consequence is that risk aversion at the wrong moments is not safety. It is the act of locking in losses while eliminating the opportunity for recovery. And the higher your balance grows, the more psychologically difficult it becomes to tolerate the volatility required to grow it further. I'm not done yet. The other dimension of this rule is that people at $100,000 often start avoiding good financial risks as well. The business idea they've been developing. The real estate investment that has reasonable fundamentals. The career pivot that would mean a short-term pay cut but a better long-term trajectory. They now have something comfortable to protect, and protecting it feels more urgent than growing it. The result is a quiet, comfortable stagnation that never produces a crisis, but also never produces the wealth or freedom they're working toward. Rule 6. Crossing $100,000 triggers a specific lifestyle renegotiation that most people don't recognize until it's already complete. At lower income levels, most people have an implicit understanding of what they can and can't afford. The constraints are clear. You don't agonize over whether to upgrade your apartment because the math is obvious. You don't debate whether to buy the $80,000 car because there's no debate to be had. The scarcity itself provides clarity. At $100,000, the constraints loosen. And that loosening is not a gift. It's a test. Suddenly, many things feel technically possible. The nicer apartment, technically possible. The newer car, technically possible. The international vacation, technically possible. The expensive hobby, technically possible. And, because they're technically possible, they start to feel like reasonable options rather than extraordinary ones. You're not stretching anymore. You're just living appropriately for your income level. But here is what's actually happening. You're renegotiating every category of your lifestyle simultaneously, and each renegotiation locks in a new, higher monthly expense that you'll then need to maintain indefinitely. The apartment upgrade costs you $600 more per month, $7,200 per year, for as long as you live there. The car upgrade costs $400 more per month, $4,800 per year, for 5 years. The vacations, the restaurants, the wardrobe, the gym, each one seems small in isolation. Together, they can consume $2,000 to $3,000 in additional monthly expenses within the first year of crossing 6 figures, before you've made a single large or obviously extravagant decision. The hidden consequence is that this renegotiation happens quietly and then becomes permanent. It's very easy to upgrade. It's psychologically very difficult to downgrade. Once the lifestyle costs $8,000 a month, living on $6,000 feels like failure. The new baseline isn't a choice you consciously revisited. It's just the water you're swimming in now. Rule 7. The way you think about your future self will determine whether this income level changes your life or just changes your expenses. Most people at every income level have a weak relationship with their future self. Psychologically, research consistently shows that people experience their future self as almost a stranger, someone they feel responsible for in theory, but not urgently in practice. Saving for retirement, at the emotional level, feels like giving money to a person you've never met. This becomes critically important at $100,000 because the potential to make meaningful investments in your future self is now real. The capacity is there. The question is whether you experience the future version of you vividly enough to make the sacrifices the present version of you needs to make. Here's the math that most people never sit with directly. If you are 30 years old, earning $100,000, and you invest $20,000 per year starting today, at a 7% average annual return, you will have approximately $1.9 million by age 60. If you wait 5 years to start, until you've figured things out, until you feel more settled, and invest the same amount, you'll have approximately $1.3 million. The 5-year delay costs you $600,000. Not because you invested less. Because time itself is the engine, and you gave it 5 fewer years to run. The psychological insight is that making this concrete, putting actual numbers to the actual cost of delay, changes behavior in a way that abstract advice about starting early never does. You are not deciding between saving and spending. You are deciding between $1.9 million and $1.3 million. When the choice is framed that way, it lands differently. But here's what most people miss. This is the exact moment in their careers when the decision matters most. Not when they're 50 and the math is obvious. Now, at the beginning of 6-figure earning. The next 5 years of decisions will have more compounding impact on your ultimate financial position than nearly any other 5-year period in your life. Rule 8. $100,000 is the income level where your financial blind spots become expensive, not just inconvenient. At lower incomes, not knowing about tax optimization costs you a few $100s. Not understanding investment vehicles costs you modest returns on modest balances. The consequences of financial ignorance are present, but they're limited by the scale of what's available to go wrong. At $100,000, the scale changes. The same blind spots now produce five-figure annual losses. And because the losses are invisible, they're not money you're spending, they're money you're failing to build. Most people never see them. The most common and most costly blind spot at this income level is not maximizing tax-advantaged accounts. A person earning $100,000 who contributes nothing to a 401k is paying taxes on income they could have deferred. At a 22% federal rate plus state taxes, failing to contribute the maximum $23,500 could cost them $6,000 to $9,000 in taxes in a single year that they simply didn't have to pay. Over a career, the compounding impact of that annual tax savings being invested instead of paid is a number that should alarm you. The second most common and costly blind spot is treating an employer match as optional. If your employer matches 401k contributions up to 4% of your salary and you're not contributing at least 4%, you are declining free money. At $100,000, 4% is $4,000 per year. You are leaving $4,000 on the table annually. Over 20 years, with compounding, that unclaimed match is worth somewhere between $160,000 and $200,000, depending on returns. People do this routinely because setting up the contribution feels complicated and non-urgent, and there's always something more pressing today. Rule 9. The comparison trap becomes significantly more expensive at this income level, and it targets a new and more costly set of purchases. Social comparison is a feature of human psychology at every income level. But the specific things being compared and their price tags escalate dramatically at six figures. Below $100,000, the social comparison tends to be relatively affordable. Cars, clothing, phones, apartments. The gap between what you have and what others have is real but contained. At $100,000, the comparison set shifts. Your new peer group, whether actual or aspirational, is comparing homes, not apartments. Vacations to Europe, not road trips. Private school conversations at dinner parties. Investment properties. Kitchen renovations. The stakes of the comparison escalate at exactly the same time as your ability to respond to the comparison financially. Here's a real-world scenario that plays out repeatedly. You cross six figures. Your social environment shifts, or your perception of your social environment shifts. You start going to dinners where people own homes you want to own. You feel behind. You accelerate your timeline for buying a home before you're genuinely financially ready. You buy a house at the top of what you can technically afford, with a down payment that drains your liquid savings and a monthly payment that requires your full income with little room for margin. You are now house rich and cash poor, with no financial cushion, holding an illiquid asset that requires ongoing maintenance in a market you can't control. And you did it because the comparison made you feel like you were falling behind. The hidden consequence is not just the financial strain of the purchase itself. It's that the purchase eliminates your ability to take other meaningful financial steps for years. You can't invest aggressively. You can't take career risks. You can't build a savings buffer. The comparison didn't just cost you the house. It cost you a decade of financial flexibility. Rule 10. Your emergency fund requirement goes up significantly when your income goes up, and almost nobody adjusts for this. The standard advice, 3 to 6 months of expenses in a liquid, accessible account, is correct in principle and widely ignored in practice at every income level. But at $100,000, there's an additional dimension that most people overlook entirely. When your income is $40,000, losing your job and needing to find another one is serious, but relatively navigable. Jobs at that income level are more numerous. The hiring process is typically faster. Your monthly obligations, presumably scaled to that income level, are manageable on savings for a few months. When your income is $100,000 and you've built a lifestyle that requires most of it, losing that job is a different kind of emergency. Jobs at this level are fewer. Hiring processes are longer, often 3 to 5 months from application to offer. Your monthly obligations are higher. The speed at which a six-figure income disappears into a lifestyle built around it is remarkable and deeply uncomfortable when the income stops. This means your emergency fund at $100,000 should realistically be closer to 6 to 9 months of expenses, not 3. And if your field is specialized, your industry is cyclical, or your role is senior enough that comparable positions are rare, 12 months is not excessive. Most people at this income level have 1 to 2 months of expenses saved at most, because the income feels stable enough that the emergency fund feels unnecessary. It isn't. The higher your income, the longer the runway you need between income disruption and financial crisis. Rule 11. Earning more expands the menu of financial mistakes available to you, not just the menu of financial opportunities. This is the rule that most personal finance content about reaching six figures quietly omits because it's not an inspiring message. But it's an honest one. At lower incomes, the financial decisions available to you are limited. You can't take on a jumbo mortgage. You can't invest in complex instruments. You can't make large, irreversible financial commitments because the institutions that enable them require income you don't yet have. In a strange way, lower income is protective. The range of ways you can seriously damage your financial future is constrained by what you're able to access. At $100,000, that constraint loosens. You can now qualify for a mortgage that could overextend you. You can take on business debt that could bankrupt you. You can invest in alternatives that could go to zero. You can make financial commitments to a lifestyle, to a family structure, to a geographic location that lock in expenses for years or decades. The expanded access is real, but so is the expanded exposure. The psychological insight here is that capability and readiness are not the same thing. You can qualify for a $500,000 mortgage without being ready to carry one sustainably. You can access investment products without having the knowledge to evaluate them. The threshold at which financial institutions will lend you money or sell you products is a business calculation, not a judgment about your financial health. Treating access as endorsement is one of the most consistent sources of financial stress I've observed at this income level. Rule 12. How you talk about money to yourself and to others will shape your financial outcomes more than almost any strategy you implement. This sounds soft. It isn't. The internal narrative you carry about money determines which information you pay attention to, which decisions feel natural, and which behaviors you sustain or abandon. A person who believes that wealth is for other people, that money is inherently stressful, or that thinking carefully about finances is somehow greedy or tedious will consistently underperform their own financial potential, not because of strategy gaps, but because of attention gaps. At $100,000, the narrative that shows up most often and does the most damage is this one: I make enough that I don't need to track it carefully. This narrative feels like abundance. It's actually negligence. Money that isn't tracked doesn't disappear, but it doesn't accumulate either. It flows along the path of least resistance, which is almost always towards spending rather than building. The external narrative matters as well. How you talk about money with your partner, your family, and your friends sets the social contract for how those relationships interact with your finances. Couples who don't discuss money explicitly, who avoid the conversation because it's uncomfortable, consistently make financial decisions in misalignment. One person is quietly saving toward an early retirement. The other assumes the lifestyle will continue to escalate. The misalignment isn't discovered until it's a crisis. The practical application is that you need a written financial plan, not a complex one. A clear, honest document that says, this is what we earn, this is what we keep, this is what we're building toward, and these are the specific rules we've agreed to follow. It doesn't need to be longer than one page, but it needs to exist outside your head, where it can be referenced, revisited, and shared. Rule 13. The habits that got you to $100,000 are not necessarily the habits that will make $100,000 work for you. This is the transition point that most people miss entirely because it requires admitting that the strategies that worked in one phase of your financial life need to be actively replaced in the next. Getting to $100,000 typically rewards a specific set of behaviors: working hard, advancing in your career, developing skills the market values, being reliable and promotable. These are income growth behaviors. They're important. They got you here. But building wealth from $100,000 requires a different set of behaviors: deliberate spending, consistent investing, tax optimization, patience, and the ability to resist the social and psychological pressures that this income level specifically generates. These are wealth-building behaviors, and they don't come automatically from the habits that grew your income. The transition requires you to consciously shift your primary metric. For most of your career up to this point, the metric was salary. How much do I earn? That's the number you tracked, celebrated, and optimized for. From this point forward, the metric that matters far more is net worth. How much have I built? And those two numbers are connected, but they are not the same thing and they do not move together automatically. Marcus never made this transition. He kept optimizing for the income metric. He got raises. He chased the next level. The net worth barely moved because the behaviors that grow income and the behaviors that build wealth are genuinely different, and you have to choose to shift from one to the other. Rule 14: time is the asset that $100,000 earners consistently undervalue, and the cost of undervaluing it is enormous. When you cross six figures, a specific temptation appears that didn't exist before. You can now afford to buy convenience in ways you previously couldn't. Meal delivery every night. Services that handle everything from laundry to car maintenance to grocery shopping. Premium subscriptions that save you friction. The ability to pay your way out of any time-consuming inconvenience. None of this is inherently wrong. Some of it is genuinely valuable. But there is a version of this behavior that is quietly corrosive, and it's worth naming directly. Spending money to avoid discomfort is different from spending money to buy time for things that matter. If you spend $300 a month on food delivery because you hate cooking and the time saved goes toward meaningful work, creative output, exercise, or quality time with people you love, that might be a sound trade-off. If you spend $300 a month on food delivery because you're watching television and the convenience has become a habit, you're spending $3,600 a year to outsource something that costs you nothing meaningful but a small amount of effort. At $100,000, the convenience spending available to you can easily reach $1,500 to $2,000 per month if you're not paying attention to it. That's $18,000 to $24,000 per year. Invested over 20 years, that number becomes something that could meaningfully reshape when and how you retire. The rule is not austerity. The rule is intentionality. Every convenience expense should pass a genuine audit. Is this buying me something I'm actually using? Is the time I'm saving going towards something that matters to me? If the answer is yes, spend freely. If you're not sure, that uncertainty is worth sitting with. Rule 15. The financial ceiling of $100,000 is not an ending. It's a leverage point, and most people treat it as a destination. This is the last rule, and it might be the most important one. $100,000 is not where the journey ends. It's the point where the compounding of both good and bad decisions starts to become powerful enough to define your financial future. The good decisions compound into real wealth. The bad decisions compound into a beautiful-looking, financially fragile life. Priya understood this. She treated the milestone not as a rival, but as the beginning of a new game with new rules and new stakes. She designed her financial life in the first 30 days. She set up automatic investments before her lifestyle had time to inflate. She built an emergency fund that matched her new risk exposure. She had an honest conversation with herself and the people close to her about what she was building and why. She wrote down her number, the specific figure that would represent genuine financial independence, and she built a plan that pointed in that direction. Marcus treated it as a rival. He spent years chasing the number, and when it came, he exhaled. He let the lifestyle expand. He relied on his future motivation to manage the money that his present habits were absorbing. He didn't design anything. He let it happen to him. And it happened to him in all the ways we've discussed. Transition to closing. Both of them earned the same threshold. Both of them sat with that number at 31 or 29 and felt some version of the feeling Marcus described in that parking lot. The pride of it. The relief. The sense of something promised finally delivered. The difference between their outcomes is not explained by discipline in any vague, motivational sense. It's explained by a series of specific, concrete decisions made in a specific, narrow window of time, the first year after crossing the threshold. Identity decisions. Tax decisions. Lifestyle decisions. Savings decisions. Social boundary decisions. That window exists for everyone. It's available. It doesn't require extraordinary willpower or unusual sacrifice. It requires knowledge, knowing what the decisions are and why they matter, and then acting on that knowledge before the lifestyle closes the window behind you. If you are approaching this number, the window hasn't opened yet. You can design for it now, deliberately, without the pressure of managing the moment. If you've recently crossed it, the window is open. The decisions that matter most are the ones you make in the next 90 days, not the next 90 months. If you crossed it years ago and you recognize Marcus in the story, recognize the drift, the gap between what you earn and how you feel about money, the window can reopen. It requires more deliberate effort to walk back lifestyle inflation than to prevent it. But it is not closed forever. Here's the line that Marcus eventually told me, years later, after he'd rebuilt, after he'd made the decisions he should have made in that parking lot. He said, "The number I was chasing was never the destination. It was just a bigger stage for the same choices I'd always been making. The stage is yours now. Choose deliberately." Oh, Utiro, soft music, reflective tone. End card. If this video changed how you see the milestone you've been chasing, or the one you're already standing in, share it with one person who needs to hear this before they get there. The next video in this series breaks down exactly how to design your financial life in the first 30 days of a major income change, the specific accounts to open, the automations to set up, and the one conversation you need to have before the lifestyle takes over.